Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
Before we begin this week's discussion, I want to tell you about a virtual panel event co-hosted by the Information Professionals Association and the AFCEA Alamo chapter. The panel will discuss convergence and information advantage in a hyper-competitive information environment. And as a touch point, the discussion will be framed by a recently released Defense Science Board report regarding global competition in the information environment. The panel will be from 12 to 1:30 Eastern Standard Time on October 29th. That's a Thursday. You can find out more information at information-professionals.org/events, and there will be a link to this in the show notes as well. Today on the Cognitive Crucible, we have two guests. First, Colonel Michael Jackson is Chief for Plans, Policy, and Partnerships at the Cyber National Mission Force. He was previously the Senior Army Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Colonel Jackson has served as an Information Operations Officer since 2003 at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels, collaborating with interagency partners, NATO allies, and with partner nations. Also joining us is Dr. Paul Lieber, who is COLSA Corporation's Chief Scientist for Data and Social Science, where he specializes in communication influence. A board member of the Information Professionals Association, or IPA, he previously served as the command writer for 2 U.S. SOCOM commanders, likewise Strategic Communication Advisor to Special Operations Command Australia. Within academic environs, Dr. Lieber was full-time graduate faculty at both civilian and military institutions. Colonel Jackson and Dr. Lieber, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, John.
And I do want to mention at the outset that for Colonel Jackson, it's important to state that his views are his own and do not represent the views of the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government in general. And I want to give a special thanks to Mike Jackson. He is the first active duty military guest on the Cognitive Crucible. And for IPA, we are very explicitly wanting to bridge the communication gap between the military information operations community and academia, policymakers, et cetera, et cetera. So Mike Jackson, special thank you to you, and we welcome additional active duty military information operators onto the Cognitive Crucible. So Mike, I'd like to start with you. You and Paul recently co-authored an article that appeared in the Cyber Defense Review called Countering Disinformation. And you ask the question, perhaps, are we our own worst enemy when it comes to countering disinformation? I'm hoping that, Mike, you can start out by, maybe adding a little bit of additional color to your information operations career and, maybe recap some of the observations that you have had which caused you to ask that question in the first place. Are we our own worst enemy?
Hey, John, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And so first off, my comments and perspective, a lot of this article was written based off of my time in Stuttgart, Germany, which started in 2014 and went through 2019. So it's important to recognize that this period covered 2 administrations during a very interesting time, working within DoD, but also getting an opportunity to work with the whole of government. And just from understanding what's kind of shaped my career over the years is I first got interested in information operations in high school. We had a radio and television studio. I really enjoyed it. Went to college and did marketing. And then when I came to the Army, the first 8 years, I was an armor officer But in 2003, I became a public affairs officer in a NATO headquarters and fairly quickly got put as the chief for information operations at a joint headquarters there in Lisbon, Portugal, and switched to information operations very quickly. And since then, I've had the opportunity to be Brigade Division Corps theater TSOC level, and then as well as the combatant command level. So understand my background in marketing really shapes the way that I do look at information operations and our role as a synchronizer, and understanding how the message is developed, and it's not just about countering disinformation, which goes to, so I do have a tongue-in-cheek the way I approach things. Paul and I were finishing up the article, and we're trying to find a name. A name really does matter because it gets people's attention. There's a song from the 90s by a group called Lit, about being your own worst enemy. I have been in meetings a couple of different times, multiple times over the years, where that song will kind of pop in the back of my head because we begin to fight each other instead of fighting the problem and beat ourselves up. So that was the source of the title. But I thought it was really important when you look at territorialism, which is a big thing that the article does talk about it, territorialism in the United States government, and how we begin to compete and fight against one another sometimes rather than work together. Now, with that, I do think when you look at the United States government and the capability that we have, from the outside, you will look at a lot of things and just be amazed at the number of things that we can do and start to lob, and when it comes to communications and information, at an adversary. Because we're so diverse, and because it's kind of the mission command concept that the military has of leveraging, getting a mission and running with it and focusing on the problem, but not needing direct guidance on how to do it. The reality when you're inside, that goes back to the messy part, it can get kind of messy, but when you leverage that, it is such a huge strength. And that is the ultimate and the conclusion of the article is, yeah, we can be our own worst enemy sometimes, but ultimately, I think overall, we are a significant power to be dealt with, and we have extreme capability to really be effective in the messaging campaign. We just need to work on focusing and collaborating in that a little bit.
Okay, fantastic. Paul, I want to bring you into this a little bit. In the article, you guys, start off as, it seems like a touch point with a recent book by Richard Stengle on information wars. Could you talk about how that book, helped frame some of your arguments in the article?
Yes, as Mike was alluding to in terms of his experiences, a lot of the approaches to tackling information in general as a broad concept are really derived from one's perspectives of their organization that, of course, are empowered or disempowered, if you will, by the authorities that organization has to operate in. So a lot of the stuff that we've seen in terms of the struggles and the challenges in the information space really goes back to the territorialism, there we go, that Mike was referring to, and Stengel was very big on the State Department and that state-specific approach to tackling information and also an influence in how to be successful in that space. One of the things that that I wanted to give a caveat to Mike's comments. It's looking at a broader collaborative approach, which we make the argument for that really is the present and future success potential of information. To really do it right, we have to look beyond from inside organizations and what their authorities are. But I also want to give the caveat that that it isn't for lack of trying. I think that we spend a lot of time in looking at the information problem space, especially in disinformation and misinformation, and feeling like failures because of the fact that maybe we haven't collaborated enough, or maybe our approaches weren't successful in potentially, say, countering peer competitors. But at the same time, it's important. Going back to Mike's reference to Lit, the song. It's important that when you're doing that, and maybe being a little constructively critical, to realize that it's not that you're not trying to do something, you're not trying to do the right thing. There's a lot of people out there trying to tackle this problem set from different angles and perspectives. And going back to the Stengel book, I think Stengel, defaults to using one perspective, primarily State Department focused, on tackling this. But in doing so, it also dismisses the fact that there are individuals like Mike Jackson that had throughout their careers have really tried to tackle this problem set. And I think a lot of the struggles that we're running into in information, are twofold. One, it is, those proverbial stovepipes, but it's also the fact that folks that have this in their portfolio are just too self-critical. They really don't see that that what they're doing can be meaningful because it hasn't necessarily reached the success criteria that maybe others or even themselves expect of it.
Yeah, I agree that very few people. It doesn't matter whether it's government or even business. Very few people put on their uniform or their business clothes every day and say let's go to work and figure out how we can mess things up, or let's go to work and not make any progress. So we should assume, I think, that most people are well intentioned. It's just putting together a coordinated, whole of government or whole of society effort to counter the information challenge is it's hard for sure. I want to use this as a moment to transition to talk about an initiative that started back, I think it was in the 2015 timeframe, according to the article. Mike, you were, I believe, integrally involved in a EUCOM and State Department combined effort creating what you called the Russia Information Group, or the RIG. Could you talk about the RIG or what you can talk about? Could you please recap for the audience, and then connect the dots between this effort and your observations and some constructive things that we can do to use it as a way to as an exemplar for other organizations to try to tackle the information problem?
The idea for the RIG started, so my 1 year at Special Operations Command Europe wasn't my first introduction, but I'd been both to Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think it's a fair criticism that our collaboration across the interagency was not always as strong as it could have been. I think there's periods where it was extremely strong. There's periods where there were probably some very difficult relationships there. Having seen that and being frustrated by that, and now walking into Iraq and Afghanistan are unique because DoD it's a combat zone. DoD has primacy there. When you move into Europe, now that's not the case anymore. State Department and the Chiefs of Mission or the embassies have primacy there. So the Russia Influence Group was an understanding that if EUCOM, Russia was a rising influence issue that we're having in Europe, if EUCOM, who has a significant amount of capability, both, I call it verbally and non-verbally. So you have exercises, statements, visits that you do, but there's also messaging things that you can do. In order to do that effectively, EUCOM can't do alone and DoD can't do alone. It has to work with its counterparts. Specifically, it has to work with Department of State. And there was a divide that I was seeing between the Chiefs of Mission, the individual embassies across the 50 plus countries, and then the State Department back in DC. And how did we make aware what we were trying to do? So when I got up to European Command, the idea came up of, look, let's start with just building a common understanding, not just DoD and state, but all the departments and agencies across the whole of government, Treasury, Justice, FBI, the intelligence community, other communities are doing things within Europe, and just build an understanding of what's going on first. So that was the first fundamental question for the interagency. And to start this group, so the very first meeting was just an action officer level meeting where we got together there in DC up by Tyson's Corner. I was surprised about 50 people showed up. 50 different organizations and agencies showed up to build that understanding.
This is still the 2015 timeframe?
This is still that timeframe, yeah.
Okay.
Just the RIG to build the understanding. And what it evolved into is pulling in senior leaders to get them to also contribute to the understanding, because we found out, we talked very quickly that when you built an organization like this, because there's multiple groups across government that will try and start to do the organizational level, that's good at the action officers, but you need the organizational commitment and buy-in, and that's why we built the two-tiered group, bringing the senior leaders in to kind of give guidance, which evolved into a biannual group that we had senior leaders come in to give guidance for a 6-month period, and then we would meet monthly at the action officer level just to discuss the actions that were going on in Europe to counter Russian influence. And then we built that into actually projecting forward off what we were doing, what we wanted to do. EUCOM's approach was pretty unique, and actually General Scaparrotti is an incredible leader, because this was just one of the things that he had going on. He had the Russia Influence Group, which allowed him to look at the interagency and work and collaborate with them. But then he also had an annual Chiefs of Mission conference where he'd bring the 50+ Chiefs of Mission in together to talk about what we wanted to do to go forward and collaborate at the embassy level. But then we would have some of the interagency and the RIG would come and talk there. And then the third level that we had was the Russia Strategic Initiative, which looked at the Department of Defense level, where the combatant commands and the services would get together with, once again, Department of State and other involvement. And when you put those three tiers together, it allowed us to look forward. And ultimately, the big theme was the collaborative approach, that this was not just a DoD problem. In fact, it was a United States problem within Europe, with Department of State in the lead. But DoD had significant resources, one being planning capability, two being a leadership capability and the ability to convene, which is what we leveraged to actually project, understand what we're doing once again, and then project forward where we wanted to go, and then to begin a discussion of evaluating the effectiveness of what we were doing.
So, yeah, Paul, you have extensive experience in the information environment as well, especially at SOCOM. Could you bring in some of your perspective on the challenges of collaboration and positively engaging in the information environment?
Yeah, perhaps the biggest problem at any global or rather geographic combatant command is the issue of redundancy when it comes to tackling the information problem set. So what I try to do, and what I'm still trying to do, is are two things. One is to educate folks on what others are doing in the space, so they're not duplicating effort, and also two, that they're being able to maximize others' contributions and using it to advise their current and future plans. So making sure that anyone who's gathering information is hopefully sharing it with those with a vested interest in it, and also two, that they're talking to the right people. So they're not doing any of their efforts, be it information operations, survey, collections, anything all across the spectrum of information, that data, if you will, that it's being, and even just in general, that like just their perspectives are being shared widely and as much as possible. So they're, again, so it's informing. The second is trying to be a resource for those that have questions. So what I found is having that bit of duality in practitioner and researcher. I get a lot of questions on methodology because folks struggle with how they can create valid measures of performance, effectiveness, but also what does a research program look like, and how do they know what right is when they see it? And then, of course, on the training and education space, to try to be, upon request, as active as possible, to ensure that that individuals are receiving the information they need to do their jobs better. So it really is, to summarize that, it's really connecting the dots between stakeholders, to provide them with incentives to collaborate as well. And part of that incentive is to be readily available. One of the ways that Mike and I connected was really was that it was two individuals with a vested interest in this space that were not formally linked to each other for collaborative purposes. But then the more that that we engaged in communication, the more it made sense for us to collaborate on this article, and then to continue to collaborate and to find ways to broaden our networks to include other stakeholders, as Mike had pointed out, at the RIG and others, to make sure that we're creating a bit of a unified approach and response. Not necessarily that they're all the same, but that's not how you solve this, because authorities, again, will dictate that, and also needs and requirements. But just making sure individuals are speaking to each other, and as requested and as possible, try to be a resource for others. And at SOCOM, because it's such a is global, and the TSOCs do have individual needs, as Mike was pointing out. It is important that anyone across the world knows that they have touch points that are eager and willing to help them. So from my perspective, I think that's been, the greatest way of creating instantaneous positive gain on this problem.
Yeah, that's wise words for sure. I want to zoom back out as we conclude here, and get both of your opinions, your take at the great power competition that we find ourselves in right now, and maybe start with you, Mike, but just try to answer the question and take this in whatever direction you want. But what's at stake here? I mean, why has information zoomed to the forefront of our national security discussion? I mean, on one hand, information operations and using information in the worldwide struggle is nothing new, but there is definitely a very new and vivid way of examining the problem today. So I'm hoping that both of you can talk about, from your perspective, what's at stake here.
Well, what's at stake, and part of it goes just going back to one of the things I said when it comes to getting the interagency work together and getting past. It's so easy because the way the United States government is made to turn it into a competition as opposed to a partnership moving forward, and to get past that mindset. And that really goes back to the core of what the RIG and the Chiefs of Mission Conference and the RSI was trying to do that. And then as far as, you're right, information is not new. The way we communicate and the speed which we can share it. And I do think one of the fascinating things that I look at right now is the way what we were 6 months ago, or back in January, and the way everything changed in March, where you've already had information. And you look at a good book, a reference that I do make, pardon language, but it's called Mindfuck by Chris Wiley, talks about Cambridge Analytica. It's not what happened. It's the ability and how the thought process was made to manipulate information that is so fascinating, as we as information professionals really need to understand. Now you flash forward where you had the vulnerability of target audiences. You moved into the COVID environment where people stopped interacting face to face. They became more isolated into their social media space and these other spaces. And it's a whole new world now. And it's very fascinating to understand. And I think that's when you go into the great power competitions, the ability to communicate with specific target audiences, but also, do we really understand the vulnerability of those target audiences and the way our adversaries are able to either make it more complicated for them, but how does it also make it easier for them to manipulate information? We really need to understand that. So like I said, we are in a brave new world right now that we really need to understand.
Actually, I'm going to counter that last point that Mike had and agree with the rest. I don't think we're in a brave new world. In fact, this world has been around for decades. We're just finally admitting that that it's there. And I know Mike is agreeing with me on this, because I know we've had conversations on it. It's the notion that in great power competition that we have potential adversaries or competitors at best that are willing to use information in ways that and willing to approach it in terms of an overall strategy, be it through strategic communication, a systematic process of disseminating information, creating engagements, applying the information, making decisions on it, and mixing that with other strategic and tactical types of initiatives. They're willing and able, and they've been doing it for decades. We're finally now, out of necessity, faced with, the recognizance that we can't sit still any longer and just try to, admire the problem by throwing resources and capability at it without actually looking in the mirror and stating, what can we do? I'm not talking about being nefarious or going beyond what, authorities are there. You don't have to do that. It's actually accepting the fact that there are better ways to conduct business, which goes back to my original point on, you don't turn around and throw the baby with the bathwater. You don't throw them out. And part of the challenges that I'm seeing is in realizing that, especially in information operations, that prior approaches weren't necessarily compatible with the way our peer competitors think about the world. It doesn't mean you turn around and dismiss all those contributions. Rather, you repurpose what we're doing, and the individuals that are associated with it harness their skills and start trusting more in information as literally a phenomenon, and approaching it from that perspective, not as a tool or or a bullet that you just use. I think we've been doing that for far too long, and in doing so, we've undermined our ability to create influence. And when Mike talked about vulnerable populations, these populations are well aware of the different approaches that are being used to impact them. And, and from my professional perspective and from where I sit, the U.S. government, not any individual entity, the entire interagency must be willing to embrace, not just adopt, embrace the use of social science and data science to solve the information problem sets. Mike started, by creating the framework, the mechanisms in place for this mindset to be successful. Yes, now is the time, but it's been that time for 2 decades that we could have applied that. I know from 2015 now, yes, the framework is definitely more fleshed out and more formalized, but we've got to have a mindset, now that the framework is there, to really attack this in a way that is, again, aligned with peer competitors that are using science and that have that a core part of their overarching philosophy when they look at information. So away from content and more toward contextual, if I was going to summarize it.
All right, very good. We will put into the show notes a link to your excellent Cyber Defense Review article, as well as a link to the book you mentioned, Mike, Mindfuck. And with that, Colonel Mike Jackson and Dr. Paul Lieber, thank you both for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, thanks, Sean. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.